This video has kind of ballooned into something beyond what I was originally going to do. At first I thought, hey, let's look at the 6800 XT versus the 7800 XT with FSR3 on versus off and see if they scale any differently between the generations. But then I was thinking, well, specs-wise, the 7800 XT is actually closer to a 6800. So I threw the 6800 into the mix and went ahead and made this a full-on review in a whole bunch of the newest games at a variety of graphics settings and resolutions and all of that. And the other reason why I wanted to throw in the 6800 is price. The 6800 non-XT version has been hanging out at $399.99 for quite a while now. At first I saw this price once and it disappeared again, but now it's been consistent for at least a couple of weeks, making that a very strong card with 16 gigabytes of VRAM while the supplies last. I have no idea how long they will. The 6800 XT version has been hanging out around $500, but sometimes down as low as $490, which is what we're seeing today. And then the 7800 XT, as far as newer generation GPU goes, offers a lot of value at $500. So in this video, we're going to be comparing those three GPUs, the 6800, the 6800 XT, and the 7800 XT. In tons of the newest games, they're all 16 gigabyte cards, but again, we're looking at different generations. I will be looking to see if there's any difference in performance scaling with FSR3 enabled versus disabled. And also the other thing I want us to think about is, okay, what is the value proposition here? Because if you look at the prices and you divide them, there's a certain, multiplication factor here. In other words, if we look at the 6800 XT versus the 6800, 490 divided by 400, it's 22.5% more expensive to buy the XT version. Does it deliver that much more performance? If we look at the 7800 XT versus the $400 6800 non-XT, it's 25% more money. Is it worth 25% more money? Does it offer that much more performance? And then the 7800 XT and the 6800 XT are functionally equivalent at a 2% price gap right now. What is the performance difference, if any? Is it worth it? That's what we're gonna look at in this video. Now, if you're interested in how these compare against Nvidia GPUs, I've already done comparisons of these GPUs versus similarly priced Nvidia GPUs. And I think in the $400 to $500 bracket, these GPUs are actually offering a lot of value and are very strong contenders. But again, which one do you pick between the three? Also, what if this is a little bit out of your price range? Don't forget that you can sell your old GPU to fund your upgrade. And Jawa.gg offers the simplest and fastest way to sell your GPU. They are the sponsor of today's video. I know a bunch of people who game on PC and they have a closet full of their old graphics cards because they never got around to selling them. And I asked them why, and they're like, it's just a hassle. I don't want to have to deal with selling it locally. I don't trust people. Am I going to get scammed? Am I going to get mugged? I don't want to deal with figuring out shipping on the internet, all of that. Where do I sell it? Here's how simple Jawa makes it. Step one, you just get an offer. You click on the link in today's video description and or pinned comment, and you tell them about your GPU model and condition for an instant offer. You just literally click this get an instant offer button. Then you ship it. You will print out your free shipping label and mail them the GPU. Again, a lot of people think shipping is complicated. Well, sure, if you have to deal with it yourself, but Jawa will include the shipping price as part of the offer, so you just print out that shipping label and send it off. Then they inspect the GPU to make sure everything checks out, and that's it. You get paid. Most sellers get paid within 1 business day after the part is received. And to make an extra special deal, if you want $10 off your first purchase, use code OWEN10, and that will get you that. Jawa has a bunch of used and new parts available. And again, I'm looking at new prices when I'm pricing these GPUs out in today's video, but there can often be a heck of a deal on the used market if you want to go ahead and look at that market. Let's go ahead and jump into the benchmarks, and then I'll give you some final thoughts on the value proposition at the end. We'll start testing looking at the 6800 XT versus the 7800 XT in Immortals of Aveum at 1440p Ultra. And then we'll take a look at what happens when you turn on FSR3. So here at 1440p Ultra with native resolution, no upscaling, we're seeing the 7800 XT has a 16% performance lead in this game. The idea then will be, as we look at FSR3 enabled, do we see anything different than 16% enabled? Although we should note here that both GPUs are around 60 FPS at these settings, although the 7800 XT is more in the low mid 60s and the 6800 XT in kind of the upper 50s. So is a noticeable difference there if you are shooting for that 60 FPS mark. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at FSR3 quality setting enabled. Now, this is without frame generation. So again, I want to separate this out, right? FSR3 has an upscaler very similar to FSR2, and then it also has a frame generation feature, and currently this is with the upscaler enabled, but not the frame generation feature. I want to test that separately. And now we've seen that both GPUs are doing a lot faster. We're seeing 78-ish FPS on the 6800 XT, and around 94 on the 7800 XT, and that gives the 7800 XT a 20% lead over the 6800 XT with the quality upscaling enabled. And now let's go ahead and kick on the frame generation. Here we're seeing the 7800 XT with a 17% lead over the 6800 XT. The frame rate numbers for both jump up like crazy. Now keep in mind that, these are generated frames, they're interpolated frames that we're gaining now. So they're not responsive, they don't help the overall responsiveness of the game. There can be image quality artifacts, and don't take something like this as a great really image quality comparison test either, because I'm having to run the game unlocked, no VSync enabled, to get the maximum performance values. But the frame pacing for FSR3 frame generation is currently not very good when you have FSR disabled. But anyway, we saw a 17% lead there, which wasn't much different than what we saw without FSR3 enabled. Now, let's go ahead and look at 1080p as well. Here at 1080p Ultra, no upscaling, no frame generation, none of that. We're seeing an 18% lead for the 7800 XT over the 6800 XT, which is similar to what we saw at 1440p resolution, maybe a couple percent better for the 7800 XT. Both GPUs performing well here, with the 6800 XT averaging in the upper 70s and the 7800 XT just a little bit over 90 FPS. And once again, we're going to take a look at what happens when you enable FSR3. This time, I'm going to try out something a little bit different. At 1080p resolution, I'm not going to use the upscaler. So we're still rendering at a native 1080p resolution here, but this time using the FSR3 pathway, using the native AA setting, and then enabling frame generation on top of that. And here we're seeing the 7800 XT still with a 17% lead. So this testing is leading me to believe that the 7000 series doesn't run frame generation more effectively than the 6000 series does here. So, in other words, yes, the 7800 XT has a lead at these settings, but it did without frame generation enabled as well, and the lead is similar. Forspoken is the only other game where we can take a look at these FSR3 frame generation at this point in time. And so let's do that. At 1440p ultra high preset with FSR3 quality enabled, we're seeing the 7800 XT with a 21% lead. Keep in mind the ultra high preset does include ray tracing. And that was with frame generation off. It was FSR3 quality upscaling. Now we're keeping FSR3 quality upscaling and turning frame generation on. And now we're seeing a 16% lead for the 7800 XT. Which is, again, pretty similar to the lead that we saw without it. So once again, in this game, I'm not seeing evidence that there is a major difference between which one, generates frames with less overhead or whatever. Moving down to 1080p resolution at the ultra-high preset, which once again does include ray tracing, we're seeing the 7800 XT 20% ahead of the 6800 XT at these same settings. And then if we enable FSR3 frame generation, we have to move to the native AA pathway in order to do this. But anyway, we kick on frame generation and we're seeing the 7800 XT 15% ahead of the 6800 XT. So once again, not showing a real big advantage different than what we saw without frame generation. All right, the rest of our testing won't be focusing on FSR3 frame generation, and I also am going to throw in the RX 6800 non-XT into the mix, because currently I've been finding it available at $399, which really kind of begs the question, is it worth paying more for the XT version or the 7800 XT? Well, let's look at how they compare directly to each other. Here in Remnant 2, which is another Unreal Engine 5 game like Immortals of Aveum, we're seeing at 1440p Ultra, the 6800 XT 13% faster than the non-XT, and the 7800 XT 23% faster than the non-XT. If we go ahead and turn on FSR2 quality, this game responds extremely well to upscaling from a performance standpoint, and all the GPUs jump up performance significantly. We now see the 6800 non-XT at 79 FPS, the XT version is 15% ahead at 91 FPS, and the 7800 XT is 27% ahead of the 6800 non-XT. And if you look at the 6800 versus 7800 XT, we're seeing 91 versus 100 FPS difference there. Similar scaling in the 1% lows as well. But let's go ahead and switch up the settings. What about 1080p native? So 1080p native ultra settings, we're seeing the 6800 able to deliver around 82 FPS average in this benchmark scene. And the 6800 XT version is now 16% ahead at 95 FPS. And if you went for the 7800 XT, you would jump up to 103 frames per second, which is a 27% lead off of the baseline of the 6800. Now, if we're looking at a $500 versus $400 price tag on these, that is, something to keep in mind when you're looking at, is the extra money worth it over that 6800 while supplies last. Now let's move to another Unreal Engine 5 game. This one is Layers of Fear. The high preset is as high as this one goes, although this one lets us toggle the hardware accelerated lumen ray tracing on versus off. So here we're seeing it with the hardware accelerated lumen on. And in this case, we're seeing the 6800 able to deliver 71 frames per second. The 6800 XT able to deliver 82 frames per second, which is 16% ahead of the non-XT version. And the 7800 XT is at 87 frames per second, which is a 23% lead over the 6800 non-XT version. But what if we turn off the hardware accelerated ray tracing and stick to the software lumen, which is what we're looking at here? Well, then the 6800 is able to deliver 83 frames per second. The XT version jumps to 94 FPS, which is a 13% jump. And the 7800 XT is at 98 frames per second, which is 18% ahead of the 6800 non-XT. Now, we're going to look at lower resolution here as well. Once we finish this little benchmark scene here. But once again, pay attention to the performance scaling, because again, at $500 versus $400, that's 25% more money if you jump up to the, these 6800 and 7800 XT versions over the 6800 non-XT. Now at 1080p high with ray tracing on, we do see the 7800 XT 25% ahead of the 6800 at 125 FPS versus 100 FPS, whereas the 6800 XT is at 114 FPS, which is a 14% lead over the 6800. So again, here, if you look at a price to performance scaling, the 7800 XT is delivering even scaling with the 6800. They're offering the same price to performance, and the 6800 XT is a bit lower than that. Now, if we turn off the hardware accelerated lumen at 1080p resolution, and just look at the 1080p high preset, we're now seeing the 6800 non-XT able to hit 123 frames per second, the XT version jumping 13% to 139 frames per second, and if you buy the newer generation, you get 146 frames per second, which is a 19% lead over the 6800. And again, 1% lows showing similar scaling as well. Now in a game like this, these are all delivering way more frames per second than you actually need to enjoy the game, which is nice. But a game that delivers fewer frames per second is Starfield. So here we're looking at Starfield at 1440p Ultra preset, except I have disabled FSR and variable rate shading. So the presets in this game enable upscaling. I've turned that off here, although we will also look at some with it on. The 6800 delivers 52 frames per second in this New Atlantis area I'm benchmarking. The XT version jumps to 61 frames per second, which is a 17% lead, and the 7800 XT gets you 66 frames per second, which is a 27% lead over the 6800 non-XT. Now, if I go to the actual Ultra preset, which includes FSR upscaling at a 75% setting of, per axis of the native resolution, that gets us the 6800 up to a 60 frames per second average in New Atlantis. The XT version jumps to 70 frames per second, which is a 17% lead over the 6800 non-XT. And the 7800 XT is at 76 frames per second, which is a 27% lead over the 6800 non-XT. Now, do remember that other areas of this game are not necessarily as demanding as New Atlantis, although there are also some areas even more demanding. So where you're at in this game can affect your performance pretty greatly. Now, if we go down to the high preset, except we turn off the FSR upscaling that would come with it, that's another way to gain back performance without using upscaling. And here we see the 6800 delivering 61 frames per second, the XT version jumping to 69 nice frames per second, which is a 13% lead over the 6800. And the 7800 XT is at 77 frames per second here, delivering 26% more performance than the 6800 non-XT. So once again, in this game, we're seeing the 7800 XT often offering at least even performance scaling with the 6800, at $100 less, whereas the XT version just isn't quite there. Although it's offering similar performance to 7800 XT, it is behind, at least in the games we've tested so far. Now, if we go down to 1080p Ultra, but don't use any upscaling, so I manually have disabled that, as well as variable rate shading, we see the 6800 able to hit 63 frames per second in New Atlantis. The XT version jumps to 75 frames per second, which is a 19% lead over the non-XT version. And the 7800 XT is offering 78 frames per second. Now, let's test out some other games. How about Baldur's Gate 3? At 1440p Ultra, all three of these GPUs are delivering way more frames per second than you actually need to enjoy this style of game. I'm seeing 120 frames per second for the 6800 non-XT. The XT version jumps to 139, which is a 16% lead over the 6800, and then the 7800 XT is at 138, so functionally tied with the 6800 non-XT in this game. Now, in Baldur's Gate, dropping to 1080p, they're all now just, again, seeing similar scaling here. We are technically seeing the 6800 XT slightly ahead of the 7800 XT, but they're both closing in on 200 frames per second. If you're going to get performance issues in Baldur's Gate 3, it's much more likely to be related to CPU problems happening in more populated areas, like the denser city areas of Act 3. So anyway, I think all three of these GPUs are delivering great performance here. Now, let's look at Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. First, we'll look with ray tracing off, but then we will also look at ray tracing cranked. This is the 1440p very high preset, but with no ray tracing enabled. And using this intro kind of cutscene to get some nice side-by-side comparisons, we're seeing the 6800 XT 19% ahead of the 6800 non-XT at 111 frames per second versus 93. Whereas the 7800 XT is 118 frames per second, making it the leader overall and 27% ahead of the 6800 non-XT. What if we want to kick on some ray tracing? Well, the ray tracing settings in this game are very scalable, but what if we just want to crank them? So I went with the very high ray tracing, basically maxed it all out, and I turned on FSR2 quality to get us to actually playable frame rates when maxing out the ray tracing, and that gets the 6800 non-XT to 60 frames per second. The XT version hits 69, nice. And that's a 15% lead, and the 7800 XT is a 77 frames per second, which puts it 28% ahead of the 6800 non-XT. Now, what if we drop down to 1080p resolution, keep the very high ray tracing settings, but this time don't upscale because we're at 1080p, and FSR upscaling does not really look that great at 1080p. Here we are able to get 55 frames per second on the 6800 non-XT. We jump up to 64 frames per second, which is a 16% lead on the XT version. And then the 7800 XT hits 73 frames per second, which gives it a 33% lead over the 6800 non-XT. It also has a larger lead in the 1% lows. If we go ahead and turn off ray tracing, then we notice our frame rates go through the roof compared to with ray tracing enabled, and the game still looks really great. Anyway, the 6800 non-XT has 129 frames per second. The XT version jumps to 148, which is a 15% lead over the non-XT, and the 7800 XT hits 166 frames per second, which gives it a 29% lead over the 6800 non-XT. So once again, the 7800 XT is able to scale with its price versus the 6800 non-XT. Now, let's take a look at Star Wars Jedi Survivor, completely maxed out at 1440p. So this is the epic preset with ray tracing turned on. And I do think the ray tracing is worth using in this game if you can get good frame rates. Especially areas like with water reflections, and as we go through this cave, you know, the lighting looks a lot more realistic in this cave than when we look at it with the RT off. But anyway, the 6800 non-XT is able to hit 54 frames per second at these settings. The XT version jumps up to 60 frames per second, which is an 11% bump, but the newer generation card jumps to 68 frames per second, which was a 26% lead over the 6800 non-XT. If we go ahead and turn ray tracing off and also scale back to the high preset rather than the epic preset, we're seeing the 6800 non-XT at 75 frames per second. The XT version jumps 11% to 83 frames per second, and the 7800 XT from the newer generation is giving us 90 frames per second at these settings, which is a 20% lead over the 6800 non-XT. Minor note on the capture card footage. It looks like I had one of the settings wrong when I was recording my 6800 XT, which made it look a little bit more washed out. And that didn't happen when I was recording the other two cards, so apologies on that. It's especially noticeable when we go through that dark cave area. That should not be affecting the performance in any way, as it was an external capture card setting. Anyway, if at 1080p resolution at the epic preset with ray tracing on, so completely maxed out 1080p, the 6800 is able to deliver 75 frames per second. The XT version only gains 8% relative to that, giving 81 frames per second, but the 7800 XT does scale up to 96 frames per second, giving it a 28% lead over the 6800 non-XT version. And let's go ahead and check out some other games. Once again, same issue on the capture card settings on the 6800 XT, but Resident Evil 4 Remake at 1440p max preset, which does include some ray tracing. The 6800 non-XT is hitting 81 frames per second. The XT version hits 92, which is a 14% advantage. And the 7800 XT breaks the 101 FPS mark, giving it a 25% lead over the 6800 non-XT. Let's go ahead and turn off ray tracing, though, by going to the Prioritize Graphics preset. And at this preset, the 6800 is able to hit 119 frames per second. The XT version jumps 15% to 137 frames per second. And the 7800 XT jumps to 140 frames per second, giving it an 18% lead over the 6800. So not showing as large of scaling as we've seen in some other games. However, we're hitting very high frame rates at this point anyway. The 1080p maximum settings, max preset, which includes ray tracing, hits 99 frames per second on our 6800. The XT version jumps 14% to 113 frames per second, and the 7800 XT hits 125 frames per second, which is a 26% lead over the 6800 non-XT. Now, it's really annoying I got the capture card footage messed up. The brightness difference there looked really bad in the dark RE4 environment. Anyway, let's take a look at Last of Us Part 1 before we go. At 1440p max settings, so Ultra preset, All the GPUs are able to do pretty well here. The 6800 hits 72 frames per second. The XT version jumps 13% to 81 FPS, and the 7800 XT hits 88 frames per second, which does give it a 22% advantage over the 6800 non-XT. If we drop down to the high preset, the game still looks quite good, and we get a lot more performance. The 6800 hits 91 frames per second. The 6800 XT version gains 14% relative to that at 104 frames per second. And the 7800 XT hits 108 frames per second, which gives it a 19% lead over the 6800 non-XT version. Which again, not quite even performance scaling per dollar, but does definitely give a noticeable advantage. And if we drop down to 1080p resolution at the maximum preset, so Ultra preset, we're seeing 6800 at 99 frames per second. The XT version gains 12% performance to 111, and the 7800 XT scales up to 120 frames per second, giving it a 21% lead over the 6800 non-XT. All right, we've seen a massive amount of benchmarks. Let's go ahead and pop out for some of my final thoughts. So which one's the best deal? Again, it comes back to this. At current pricing, the 6800 XT is 22.5% more expensive than the non-XT version, and it offers no additional features or generational benefits. The 7800 XT is 25% more expensive than that $400 6800 non-XT. And so we can look at that performance, but also it does offer some additional features. It has an AV1 encoder from the 7000 series. If that matters to you, for many gamers, it doesn't. But if you're streaming to YouTube or do other video production work, the AV1 encoder could certainly be worth a little bit extra. And then also the 7000 series might have some other exclusives. Anti-Lag Plus was an AMD exclusive to the 7000 series, although currently they've pulled those drivers for compatibility with anti-cheat reasons. And then also there was going to be fluid motion frames at the driver level as a 7000 series exclusive, but AMD has extended the preview drivers to the 6000 series. But anyway, there's a little bit of features, at least AV1 encoding. And then again, do we get 25% more performance? And then the 6800 XT and the 7800 XT basically cost the same. So if that's the case, which one's better, right? Well, again, you get the feature benefit. If we scroll back through our results, I think it says everything we need to know. If we look at these percentages, first let's look at 6800 XT versus 6800. Again, it needs to be offering about 23-ish% more performance than the 6800 non-XT in order for it to make sense for which one's offering the better value. Again, they have the same features, the same VRAM, and you can see in my testing that while the 6800 XT is faster than the 6800, it is pretty much never offering as much more performance increase as it costs in a price increase. So from a strictly value perspective, the 6800 XT doesn't offer as good, as many frames per dollar as the $400 non-XT version, although from an absolute sense, it is faster. However, how about we look at the 7800 XT versus the $400 6800? If we then watch this percentage number, how much faster is the 7800 XT versus the 6800 non-XT? It often is, although not always. Let's just kind of, again, just kind of scrolling through some results, right? 23%, 27%, okay, 18%, 25%, 19%, 27%, 26%, 24%, 27%, 33%, 29%. You guys get the idea. Yes, it is sometimes offering a bit less, sometimes offering a bit more, but the point is, depending on exactly which games and settings you test, it might be slightly off, but it's right about there. It is very close to offering exactly the same frames per dollar as the $400 6800 non-XT. Although, again, it comes with like that AV1 encoder, that kind of thing on top of it. You know, you'll get longer driver support because it's a newer generation. There's some generally better features here. So, that being said, I think the 7800 XT at $500 is a slightly better deal than the $400 6800 non-XT. However, if you can't scale your budget up an extra $100, they offer very similar value. So if you're buying, if $400 is more comfortable for you, the 6800 seems to be the way to go. If $500 is within your limits, you're certainly getting at least as good of a deal, if not a better deal, probably a little better deal with the 7800 XT. It's the 6800 XT that's kind of left off here. It's literally a 2% price difference between the 6800 XT and the 7800 XT. And you can see that it's often more than a 2% performance difference between the two, although they often perform very similarly. It's not a mind-blowing difference between the two cards, and if you already have a 6800 XT, I don't think there's any reason to rush out and buy a 7800 XT. But if you're deciding which one to buy and they cost the same, the 7800 XT performs better, a little bit, and it has newer features. It'll have longer, driver support, things like that. So overall, I think the 7800 XT is the winner in this video, but also to go back and address the question of what about FSR3? Does it perform better on the newer generation? And I think what we saw here was not really. The 7800 XT in the games available was already the faster GPU, but percentage-wise, the percentage gap stays within about the same range regardless of whether FSR3 is enabled or not, and that's whether or not we're talking about the upscaler or the frame generator. If there's differences, they're not particularly meaningful. So hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. In general, I think all three of these GPUs offer good value, but at current pricing, the 6800 non-XT offers I think the best value at $400, and the 7800 XT offers the best value at $500. Again, if you're interested in the Nvidia alternatives, you can look at my reviews up against like the 4060 Ti 8 and 16 gigabyte versions, as well as you can take a look at the 7800 XT up against the 4070, which is $50 more, but you do get a lot more features. You can go ahead and take a look at that video as well. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.